We need somebody to really represent Australia. And since nobody else is volunteering, I guess it's gotta be me. When I saw a post about Overwatch, of course it's gotta be Overwatch, all those years ago making a map set in Australia, and then in that map, them using the word takeout, I was, let's just say, flabbergasted. They, of course, corrected this. They changed the sign to the correct term, takeaway, the standard term used all over the entire continent of Australia. But it raised an interesting question for me. Did they have a single Australian working on the map set in Australia? You see, some game developers talk a lot about representation, and it's my absolute favourite thing in the world because they represent diverse locations and brand new unheard of viewpoints like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and if they're daring, maybe even the American South. And it isn't just American developers either. Rockstar/Grand Theft Auto emerged out of Scotland originally, but makes games based on American culture. Finns are making games like Max Payne, set in New York. Poles make games based on an alternate version of LA. The world is obsessed with America, and at this point, isn't it a little boring? It's like, what new story are you going to tell? New York City has these cold, bitter winters. Ooh, the Wall Street, the capitalism, the consumerism, the hamburgers. I love it when they do something different. Anything different. And I don't mean fictional settings, because sci-fi often just ends up being space America. I mean other places on Earth, other cultures. Occasionally, other devs do represent their culture well. Like The Witcher, for example. It's set in Poland. Not actual Poland, but it's Poland in the same sense that Tolkien's world is England. It's a mythical representation of the real place. Now, I know why this is. It's because all the media/content they consume and all their favorite makers are from I think Write What You Know is more interesting when it's about unique cultural experiences that you know intimately, rather than movies you like that everybody else knows about as well. And what movie have most people watched that tells them everything they need to know about Australia? Obviously Mad Max. And I find the Mad Max game an interesting study, because it's made by Swedes, who are basically going off the films and general cultural cliches about the country. They were originally going to get rid of Max's Australian accent, which is just absolute sacrilege. Max is Australian. If he isn't, he's not Mad Max. That's like core to the game's identity. In the original American theatre run, they actually dubbed the original Australian actors with American voice actors. If you can't listen to an Australian accent, you can't watch Mad Max. Simple as. And this game doesn't really feel much like Australia. Besides all the American accents around, just look at it. The colours are not right. Australia has these rusty reds, dark greens, and browns. It's the colour of the earth. The most earthy part of the earth. It's really the ochre colour palette which defines Australia. The colour of the flora is distinct as well. The continent is dominated and really defined by the gum tree, the eucalyptus. It's often a mix of deep greens, bright whites or sandy light yellows, and then almost blue-grey leaves. But it can also come in all sorts of colours, like the gorgeous snow gum. The different soil composition and environment causes the continent to have completely different types of flora. Australian ecosystems are fire adapted in ways that Northern Hemisphere forests simply aren't. It actually survives getting burnt down completely, so you'll see these charred trunks sprouting new branches. Many Australian plants not only survive fire, but require it to reproduce. Banksia cones only open and release seeds after a bushfire. Grass trees flower prolifically after fire. This creates these cyclical landscapes that are constantly being renewed by fire, like the phoenix. How would you even portray this in a game? Temperate regions have these rich black fertile soils. In Australia, we've often got these ancient leached soils that are poor in nutrients. They're red because they're all oxidized, literally rusting away for millions of years. This creates these landscapes that have this incredibly rusty orange-red color palette that you don't see anywhere else. This game has just about every other color. Greys, bright whites and yellows. It has these jagged rock formations. It's a desert, sure, but it's not Australia. It just doesn't look like anywhere in the country. Tonally, it's just completely wrong. The continent is, due to its isolation, one of the most visually unique places on the planet. There are so many details about Australia that you need to get right to really evoke the correct mood. like rivers being brown. And there are a bunch of unique geological features, all the pink lakes, or the giant meteoric blue lake in Mount Gambier. There are so many potential locales you could show off in a game. It's geologically ancient, with flora and fauna that evolved in isolation for millions of years. What does being ancient mean specifically? Well, in Europe, you have a lot of relatively recent geological formations, like the Swiss Alps. That means that they have sharp, defined, pointy, like very tall mountains. A lot of Australia used to have tall mountains, but they've been worn down by erosion over millions of years. This means a lot of hills, a lot of mounds and rocks, and they're very round, very curved. We don't have as many sharp geological features. Australia is geographically stable. It doesn't sit near the boundary of a tectonic plate, it has its own. Look at some of the tallest mountains in Australia. They look worn, ancient, like Mount Zeal, and they're not all that tall. Seriously, the tallest mountain in the entire continent is less than 2,500 kilometers. It's really quite a flat country. Australia is dry as well, so a lot of river systems in the interior have really flat riverbeds that only fill after rain, like Lake Eyre. Australian deserts are not interchangeable with the Sahara or the Sonora. We don't have cacti. We do have camels, but they're not native. We also have these cute little burrowing marsupials. To get a taste of the unique geology, look at the Bungle Bungle Range in the Kimberley. These bizarre beehive-shaped formations with distinct orange and black striping. Or the famous Uluru/Ayers Rock. It's what geologists call a monolith, an exposed remnant of ancient sandstone. It's been weathered for over 500 million years. There's the wave as well. There's just so many distinct features to go off, distinct reference points for artists. This is partially a byproduct of how artists build levels in modern games. It's a bit like Halo Forge. They use prefab pieces to construct the environment. Like a big rock piece. You just place a ton of these to create a cliff. But you can't use this industry standard approach to create more unique environments, like ones with rounded soft edges, eroded rocks. The artists who are building these environments are hampered by the existing workflows. In addition to having to learn a brand new visual style with a distinct color palette. And oh yeah, they can't rely on an existing asset library, whether it be a company internal one or an online asset store, because you got to build everything from scratch for it to look right. A lot of studios may rely heavily on asset libraries and photogrammetry data collected primarily in North America and Europe. Another example of an Australian game is Forza Horizon 3. The gameplay in these is centered around the cars, while the environment is just a pretty backdrop. So they have an opportunity to represent some of the most naturally beautiful areas in Australia. And I will say it does better than most. The color palette still doesn't feel entirely right. What it certainly does do well is show the diversity of the Australian continent. Because that's what it is, a continent, larger and more biodiverse than Europe. It's kind of funny how abridged it is. Like, I know that's how they build the maps, it's kind of a best of the region that they're in, but placing the Yarra Valley next to a desert, or Byron Bay below the Great Ocean Road is just funny to me. I mean, they dedicated a whole game to the UK. This map is kind of like a map that places New York, Miami, and Baja, California right next to each other in one playable space. Like, these are just completely different environments, different weather, different wildlife, different plants, different architecture, different biomes, just worlds apart. The north of Australia is tropical. It's more like these island nations. We grow sugarcane there. There's this house called the Queenslander. It's a bit like the houses in Florida. It's built for the tropics. In the south you see a lot of bluestone, aka basalt. Try to incorporate those things if you want your environment to look like Australia. I do want to applaud them on the accuracy of the towns. They didn't do bad here. There are also some locations in the game I would say are actually less impressive in the game than they are in real life, like the Great Ocean Road. I still don't think they entirely nailed the flora here either. It doesn't look kind of dry enough. All our grass turns gold in summer. There's not enough shrubbery. It's a bit too saturated maybe. It's not rocky enough. No gibber plains, it's not scrubby. How often do you see something like the bottle brush or the golden wattle? And you know, with all the biomes they showed off, they honestly could have shown way more. Like the Black Spur in Victoria. That's one of the best drives in the world. It's a rainforest with these super tall mountain ash eucalyptus. the tallest flowering plants on Earth, and these giant ferns as well. It goes through this wet green rainforest location with waterfalls everywhere. I'll reiterate it, Australia feels ancient. Like this place feels like Jurassic Park. Now, let's take a deeper look at that Overwatch map. What's the issue with it? Well, it's just the exact same stereotype from Mad Max, the ramshackle tin shack that's post-apocalyptic. It is boring! And that's all they want to show about Australia because it's all they know about Australia. OMG, did you know that Australians are just British Texans? Can I get my Reddit gold for that one? You kind gentle sir just won the internet today. Take all my gold, kind stranger. This is so epic. Have all the bacons and maybe even a kangaroo, mate. Did you know that actually 87% of Australians live in cities? It's actually one of the most urbanized populations in the world. If Sydney and Melbourne were cities in Germany, with its 80 million inhabitants, they would be the two largest cities in Germany. It would be more accurate to represent Australia with Kath and Kim than Crocodile Dundee. There is a swelling class of effete, overly educated middle managers in Australia. That has far more presence on this big island than the rugged bushman. At least the tin shed part is accurate. That is an important material to take into account if you want to visually represent Australia. Even better, something like Colorbond steel. It's right up there next to bluestone, weatherboard, tan brick, tan bark, rusted iron. In Rainbow Six Siege, they did the same thing. Wow, it's a roadhouse in the middle of the desert because Le Mad Max was in Le Desert. Isn't Rainbow Six about Spec Ops teams? Of course, if I do a terrorist attack, I'm going to do it in the middle of nowhere where nothing happens and nobody important is and nothing important is located there. Here's one of the little niggles I have about Mad Max, starting from the second one. It's kind of Flanderized, like an over-the-top parody version of Australia. And I say this because why, in the event that the world ended and it's very difficult to survive, would you go to the center of the country where nobody lives and there is no water and it is the most difficult to survive? Even in the modern day, these remote communities literally only survive because supplies are being brought to them by the trucks from nearer to the coast. There's also the obvious American influence, like it's being a roadhouse. Now, you probably can find a couple places with this name in Australia, but it's not as common a term, at least not as common as you'd hear it in like American media. You would be more likely to hear of truckers stopping at a petrol station or servo, which is a service station, or they would stop at a pub. What's even worse is that this is the last chance for gas. Now, Australians don't put gas in their cars. They put liquid in. A liquid which they refer to as petrol. Like with the takeout debacle, you have to wonder if there was a single Australian to sign off on this. Can a game try to represent some other parts of Australia? Like you could do a city. The cities are quite distinct, wide streets, Victorian architecture, the sprawling suburbs. If you did Melbourne, you'd show off the trams, the laneways, the city built on a grid. If you did Sydney, it'd be more hilly, more curves and winding roads. You know, you can actually show some of the parts of Australia that are green. The Hunter, Call of the Wild, did an Australian DLC. It could have had a bit more unique geological features. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it feels like they still haven't quite nailed the visuals. But the biggest opportunity they had was to represent Australia's fauna, as it is a hunting game, which I think they could have done better. Some people complained about too many deer, so that may have been an issue at some point. Certainly kangaroos are far more common in Australia than deer. We do have deer, but they just aren't that common, especially compared to kangaroos. Roos would ideally be the main thing you're hunting. And there was only one variety of kangaroo? That's kind of ridiculous. Aside from that, it just seems like a random assortment from fuck knows where. A bit like Forza Horizon 3, like why so many deer? What do Australian hunters tend to hunt? Ducks, feral pigs, kangaroos, rabbits, emus? There are so many unique bird varieties that just went unrepresented on this map. Like, no emus. Australia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, and there are only 4 native species that were present in this DLC. Now, how about the culture of Australia? How do games tend to represent that part? Well, terribly. Probably even worse than the environment. Payday 2, Rainbow Six Siege, Overwatch, all of these games have, a roster of characters, and they ended up including Australian characters. And you know what the worst thing about them is? The fucking voice. Nobody sounds like this.
I'm going to enjoy tearing these cops to shreds. I need a hand! Get stuffed, shield fuck.
Do you know what this is? It's the Australian equivalent of the fucking anime voice. Like, senpai, not like this. Oh yeah? Well, Bonza, that's really great. Can you not just have some nuance in your voice performance like, a regular character would, like they're an actual person? They don't show the urban nature of Australia. They don't show different archetypes that you'd find in Australia, the language that we tend to use. There are subtle cultural differences that you only notice when you're from that culture and have other places to compare with. The diet is different even. We eat a lot more lamb than the rest of you guys do. We have basically the best public amenities in the world. Our coffee's better than anywhere else in the world, and I mean that. The $1 coffee from 7-Eleven in Australia is better than anything you could buy in Italy or in Vienna, let alone something you'd buy from an actual barista. Anyway, did you know that we ski in our own country? Or how about that we play our own football, which is actually the oldest football currently played in the world? It's older than soccer. Or we invented Wi-Fi, or these source packets where all these influencers were like, wow, Japan's so futuristic, there's no mess with these packets. Wow, Thing Japan? This is so great, but they're actually Australian. They were always Australian. And the diversity. Now, AAA devs obviously love representation, but like I said at the beginning, it always looks like just California. Australia has different immigrant groups as well. There aren't that many Latinos or people of African descent in Australia. There are a lot more Southeast Asians, Chinese, Indians. There are more Greeks, Italians, Croatians, and Lebanese. These come with their own accents and cultural quirks. Like the lamb souvlaki, that's almost a uniquely Australian thing. I didn't even realize lamb wasn't really used in gyros until I actually visited Greece myself. And obviously there are Aboriginals as well, who are basically not seen anywhere else in the world. There are some minor quirks in things like language and how we discuss the country that people everywhere else in the world mightn't know. For example, we don't really have villages per se. We have towns. We don't talk about barns. We don't have those. Those are more American. We have sheds. We tend not to have stone walls like the English countryside, but we have plenty of fences. That's how our countryside's divided. Now, what do all these games that I mentioned have in common? They're all made by foreign developers. They have no first-hand experience with Australia. So they really only have cliches to work off. They've seen maybe one movie from Australia, maybe Mad Max, possibly even Crocodile Dundee if they've really done their research. And that raises the question, why don't Australian developers come along and tell these stories? Well, there aren't that many. Seriously, when have you heard of an Australian game? Let's look at games that are made in Australia. What's the most famous one? Hollow Knight, made by a team from Adelaide. And actually, it's a very accurate representation of Adelaide. It's in a fallen city occupied by a horde of aggressive, barely sentient bugs who have turned insane, who have some pretensions of class. Oh, and the water is fucking gross and you definitely don't want to drink it. But for real, for our most famous game, it doesn't do much to represent Australian culture. It is its own world, which isn't bad, obviously, but it doesn't help us for this current predicament I'm describing. And also, it's an indie game. The only game from its small studio. And that's telling. That clues us in. Why aren't there really any large-scale developers coming out of Australia? Perhaps it's telling that there's a struggle to scale game businesses in Australia. Fallout developer Tim Kaine said,
Australia's a really cool place, though, for game development. It reminds me so much of the US in the 90s. And not just because of their music, which reminds me of 90s US music.
One issue with that, Australia had a games industry in the 90s. Australia was making games back then. It was a rich country back then. We were already a rich country back then. Why did Australia's industry not develop more? There was a Pandemic Australia, 2K Australia, Chrome Studios Australia, and they all disappeared. Although Chrome kinda made a comeback, but they had to die first at least. Why isn't development in Australia sustainable? There are also some famous mobile games made in Australia, like Jetpack Joyride, Fruit Ninja, Crossy Road. Again, small studios, small games. Still successful, but it's mobile, not hugely sophisticated, in-depth PC games. Untitled Goose Game was made in Melbourne, and they represent Melbourne quite well because you play as an annoying prick. Unpacking was another indie game from Australia. Goose Game seems to be based on England, Like it's a small English village. But they are working on another game which seems to have an Australian setting. Australia is so distinctive. You just need to hear the birds to know where you are. This actually seems kind of cool and promising. Like, I'm going to keep my eyes on this. This is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Yet again though, these are indie titles. Why do these studios so rarely scale up? There were some older games like Transformers or Ty the Tasmanian Tiger. That was like the Australian Crash Bandicoot. And these are highly regarded games. So Australia had an industry in the past, but those studios are all gone. Even Chrome died, although like I said, it was later resurrected. Ty does something to represent Australia as well, basically the mascot platformer genre, but with an Australian setting. It does have the same anime voice that I mentioned before, really playing up the slang that nobody uses in real life. Visually, it isn't quite there. The colours feel a bit more like a traditional cartoon than being uniquely Australian. There are snow levels. I like that they show off diverse environments. This would, in the future, be a good opportunity to show off more biodiversity, like the Snow Gum. There were a couple big budget games like LA Noire, made by Team Bondi in collaboration with Rockstar, and no surprise, Team Bondi isn't around anymore. And again, LA Noire is just more America. Borderlands the pre-sequel. That was a game in a large franchise that was developed in Australia. It was developed in Canberra, and like Canberra, it was boring as fuck. Okay, that's harsh. It was actually decent. And it was interesting. Apparently the story with development is that they used placeholder developer voice lines in the game with the Australian accents. And when people playtesting heard the characters with these Australian voices, they decided they wanted to keep them, like they actually fit, and it made for an interesting setting. So it ended up being like an alternate sci-fi version of Australia by a complete mistake, and I think that part of it was quite charming, although it was still Borderlands, so it was a little annoying. We weren't quite at Borderlands 3 level yet, however. Also, we circle back to that Mad Max influence with this. Once again, the studio that made it went kaput. I played a fun little indie game called Straya. It was funny, a bit overambitious with all the mechanics it has, but I think it was made by one guy, so I'll respect it. It's a funny one you can check out, I guess. Broken Roads was yet another indie game. This one was classic style isometric CRPG set in Western Australia. It's apparently post-apocalyptic, but this just looks like modern day Perth to me. This was a really cool concept and one which I was following for a while. Unfortunately, it kind of disappointed in the end. Typical problems, they were overambitious and ran out of money. What is commendable is that there is seemingly one developer on the game now who is still going back and updating the game, fixing some of the flaws that it shipped with. Maybe this game is worth a reappraisal. There could be something here. You'll notice a trend here. For some reason, it's hard to make games in Australia. Australia is culturally a laggard. Australia is poorly represented because there aren't enough Australian developers making Australian games. Why has the industry failed there? Australia is very rich, so you can't blame lack of investors, not to mention the fortune that the government has poured into arts to seemingly no avail. America and Japan are obviously thriving, China's clearly rising quickly, but that's not a fair comparison. What if we compare Australia to Europe? We can't use the population excuse then. Poland is a little bigger than Australia and has produced so many hits. The biggest studio in Europe, The Witcher, Cyberpunk, Dying Light. Sweden is smaller than Australia and has produced so many games. Machine Games and everything they've done, Paradox, Amnesia, the recent Indiana Jones game, Helldivers, and Minecraft. Not to mention the Mad Max game, the one with a ton of American accents for some reason. Finland gave us Remedy, Cruelty Squad, Angry Birds. The Czech Republic gave us Kingdom Come Deliverance, Mafia, Arma. Even tiny little Croatia gave us Crow Team, who made the Talos Principle and Serious Sam, and they've been around for basically centuries. So there's a lot of sustainable, long-term game development studios emerging out of Europe, even from these tiny countries. So that kind of answers it. Why is Australia so poorly represented in games? Because Australians aren't representing themselves well enough. Honestly, I could definitely represent Australia better than whatever they have now. In fact, this has annoyed me for so long. Whenever some TV show or YouTuber or something gets somebody on to represent Australia, it's always the worst example. Oh, I don't know how football works or what the teams are. I mean, I don't even watch football, but I still know how it works, and I still know what the teams are. I know the basics. Oh, I don't like Vegemite. Oh, I haven't been to these places in Australia. They know nothing about their own country, and they're just incurious. They have no knowledge of Australia. I really mean it. If you need somebody with knowledge of Australia, I'm just saying, I'm right here. It's always been a little pet peeve of mine because we aren't making enough big games. There are no big studios coming out of Australia, and studios that operate in Australia always seem to struggle. To be honest, this is a larger question that could certainly warrant a video of its own, but a preliminary investigation potentially tells us a few things. Australia is quite regulated. It has quite strict employment laws. It has a fairly high tax burden on people and on businesses. Although other countries like Sweden have that as well, perhaps even worse, so it doesn't tell the whole picture. I think a country needs to have a culture of experimentation and a regard for artists. Australia has quite a free market otherwise. In fact, the Heritage Foundation gives Australia a significantly higher free market score than the USA, but it also gives Sweden a higher score than the US. So a free market could influence that, but it wouldn't explain why places like Ireland or Switzerland don't make many games. Ireland seemingly has almost the perfect business environment for making a software product. Otherwise, Canada, the UK and France have tax incentives for game devs, otherwise things of that nature are quite rare. Why Sweden produces so many games is probably another question worth asking. They don't seem to have any particularly special funding, just typical arts funding which applies to all types of arts and which basically every other country has. Sweden does have a lower corporate tax rate than the US and certainly lower than Australia, although still higher than Ireland. So that corporate tax might be a contributing factor, but none of these really jump out at me as having any super strong explanatory power. There is the difference between arts funding and tax incentives. Australia doesn't have significant tax incentives, at least as it pertains to this. It certainly has the incentives if you want to buy a house. It does spend a lot on arts funding, and that seems to go nowhere. What has our arts funding done for us? Australia, like I said, is a laggard in the arts. What famous original movies came out within the past 30 years? Wolf Creek? We certainly produce the talent. How many famous Australian actors are there who don't work in Australia, who became famous from working outside of Australia? The only thing we don't suck at is music. We've been consistent with that at the very least. There's this interesting video by the creator of that indie anime Catgirl parkour game about their experience with Screen Australia's arts funding, and it sounds like a nightmare. They put so many strict requirements in the game, how it represents the country. The worst part? Screen Australia wants to control your copyright. You need their permission to use copyrighted assets. And there are clauses which grant them leverage over your IP. So basically, an unqualified bureaucrat has a significant degree of influence over your game, your creative product. It's not really arts funding then, is it? Because it's not for the sake of expression. You have to sign away your rights over your own creation for the government to get its hands on your product. That's the difference between tax incentives and government funding. Arts funding says you are privileged to be granted the opportunity to produce a product within our jurisdiction. Now follow our rules or else. Meanwhile, tax incentives for things like filming in your state or making a game in it, they say, we're so glad that you chose our state to produce your piece of work. We are privileged that you chose us and we'll do the absolute best to accommodate you. So I don't think Australia's current setup helps. What killed Australia's game industry though? I mentioned there are a bunch of studios that used to be around but aren't. Well, one possible reason is that the currencies flipped in 2012 as a result of the financial crisis. The Australian dollar became more expensive than the US dollar. It became more expensive to hire Australians. I've heard that it never truly recovered from that, because since then the Australian cost of living has only gone up as cheaper alternatives have become more viable. It's so much more expensive and difficult to rent in Australia. Australia has relatively high wages, but unlike the US, we don't have the same population and subsequent concentration of expertise to make the high wages worthwhile. Australia is also geographically separated, making it difficult to work with foreign teams in larger population areas, and it makes it more difficult to convince expertise to relocate when they have to go to the other side of the world. In addition to all the business factors, there's the culture. Maybe Australia being so hot is a deterrent. Places like Poland and Sweden are so cold for so much of the year, and the people there are stony-faced and distant, not exactly boisterous and social. Even Crow Team is from Zagreb, which is over the mountains in the cold Eastern Europe part of Croatia, away from all those beaches. How many games come out of Spain or Italy or Greece? But to counter that, I would say Americans are very loud and boisterous and jolly, and they make so many games. Consider, though, how many games are made in Florida, for example. They're from Chicago or Seattle or Maryland or North Carolina. But then you could counter that by saying Silicon Valley exists, and Texas. So the location might explain a little bit about the culture, but it's not enough. Australia isn't just a laggard in terms of arts and culture, they're a laggard in terms of innovation generally. We do have a couple of important inventions in our history, like Wi-Fi, but it's not the best environment to put those ideas into action. Aside from the business environment I mentioned, Australian culture is not friendly to innovation. We often call ourselves the lucky country without realizing where that phrase is from. It's generally used in a positive context, but it's from a book by the same name by the author Donald Horne. The full quote that this phrase emerges from is as follows: Australia is a lucky country, run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. It lives on other people's ideas, and although its ordinary people are adaptable, most of its leaders, in all fields, so lack curiosity about the events that surround them that they are often taken by surprise. So it's not exactly glowing praise for the nation of Australia. Now, keep in mind that he's referring to the leaders here, not the common man, and that's an important distinction. I think the common man, though, can demonstrate some of these negative characteristics at times. By the same token, though, we do tend to produce a lot of talent who love leaving the country. Incuriosity is a scourge in Australia, and if it's not sport or coal, Australia just does not give a fuck. Unless you're kicking an inflatable ball, you're a nobody. Tall poppy syndrome is a term that you hear used around the world, mostly Commonwealth nations, but it emerged from Australia, which makes sense because it's so severe here. It is the tendency to want to cut down the most successful in our society and bring them down to be equal to the rest of us. It really manifests in an intense and ubiquitous resentment, a kind of passive aggression that you face for standing out from the crowd. And I wouldn't say it's just about financial success, it's about being outstanding generally. It's about attracting too much attention. The reason Australians seem so chill is because they're afraid of standing out. Though you hear British, Irish, Canadians, so on and so forth talk about this or similar terms, I would say it is actually more intense in Australia than all those other countries. And this idea obviously is alien basically to Americans. Australia is kind of an anti-innovation culture. This is what informs the nanny state. It's the desire to keep people in line. It's the fear of what other people might do. It's like the culture of a prison colony. It scorns artistry. You can get a kind of a hint as to how the world views Australia by the people who choose to go there. It seems like every single British person who's around 25 years of age is moving to Australia. When I talk to them, it reveals a lot. So often, they are simply mercenary. They only talk about the money and the weather, base things, simple things. They come here because it's an English-speaking country, which they imagine is close enough to their own culture that they aren't challenged at all. They come to Australia for comfort, not to build a future. When you look at the classic immigrant stories in America, money certainly mattered a lot, but there was something more at play. There was something else. There was a mythology. It's not just about the prosperity you could obtain, though that was certainly a key component. When they arrived at Ellis Island, one of the first things they were greeted with was a personified symbol of liberty, an idea. Often we are told stories of people escaping persecution in the old world to come to a country with a stable political system, and which grants people freedom of speech, freedom to defend themselves. Regardless of whether or not that idea is true, it still influences people's attitudes within the country. It creates this national mythology. They might not have had the same sense of national unity or in-group belonging that serves as the core of many European nations, being from everywhere in the world obviously, but in America they centered their nation on an idea. a set of principles to guide the nation. Australia does not have this. It doesn't have this kind of unspoken core. There is no dreaming happening here because Australians don't dream. That's too pretentious. Mate, you're taking it a bit too seriously, I think. That indescribable core is not present. Its only mythology, really, is that of the lucky country. We landed on all this prosperity by complete accident. Don't touch anything or else you'll fuck it up. That's our attitude. Other countries arrived to where they are at now through hundreds or even thousands of years of trial and error through bloodshed and loss. Australia had kind of just landed on it. So is that simply how it has to be? Is Australia really the land of the mediocre? No, of course not. It doesn't have to be this way. It shouldn't be this way. And we can change things. It just takes a lot of effort. And we need to just be brave, be honest, and be willing to face ridicule. Be willing to build without the support of your peers. Be bold and willing to lose it all to innovate. You need this attitude for your country to grow. Australia was born in the shadow of the British Empire, but you can choose not to live in someone else's shadow. Frankly, the country can be better, and maybe through effort and authenticity, you can better represent the things you love, like your country and everything within it, without having that shadow hang over you.